back in.
Welcome everyone to this webinar about getting started with grant writing. I'm Susan, I'm your presenter for today. Thanks for signing in a few minutes early. And while we get started, if you could fill out the poll to help us understand who is there, who is here today, that would be great. Again, welcome to the session of Getting Started with Grant Writing with Enterprise Bank. I'm Susan, I'm your presenter for today. As people are signing in, if you would fill in the poll, it would help us understand who's with us today. So take a minute and fill out the poll and we'll get the results in a moment. All right, we're going to move on to a couple of different polls here in a minute. Good morning, nice to see everybody. As we get started, as people are signing in, if you could fill out the poll and let us know what role you have, we'll just give it another 10 seconds. And then Rob or Andrew, if you could show the results of the poll, that would be terrific. All right, Rob or Andrew, can you show the results of the poll about who's here? There we go. All right, so it looks like we have so far signed on a bunch of executive directors, directors of development, grant writers, great for you, program directors, a couple direct service staff, a couple board members, good for you. That volunteerism is so important to our community. Thanks for being here. Let me see what else I can see here. Oh, other volunteers, thanks for volunteering for our sector. So super important, and other, great. All right, so let's, as people are signing on again, let's Rob and Andrew move to the next poll to learn a little bit more about who's here today. Welcome everybody, so great to see you. Rob and Andrew, if I could have the next poll, there it is, great, thank you. Okay, so your level of understanding of grants, I'm super interested to hear where you guys are coming from so we can gear our presentation to your skill level today. And just be honest, it's not being recorded, it's not an evaluation. Welcome, glad to see everybody. We're just doing these couple of polls as we get started today. Please take a minute and fill out the poll. We'll just give this until 9:01 for people to provide their answers. All right, let's see. I think one more second here of filling out the poll and the results. What do the results show us? Oh, great. Okay, so we're skewing towards some basic knowledge. Great, that's perfect for today. And if you're brand new to grant writing, you've never written a grant before, don't worry, we're going to help you out today. And for those of you who have a solid background, please chime in the chat or raise your hand to add your knowledge to our talk today. And then we'll do one more poll before we get started with today. If I could have the third poll, please. Great, so as you're signing in for today, tell us, what kind of organization are you representing today? Just pick one if you represent more than one. Give this just a minute. Welcome to getting started with grants. We'll get started in just a moment. All right, I think maybe we could have the results of that poll too, Rob and Andrew. Wonderful. So let's see here. Primarily social service, education, environment and conservation are the three biggest ones it looks like. Wonderful. Okay. Social services and health. Great. It's great to have you guys here. With that, Chet, I'll turn it over to you to make opening remarks. Thanks, everybody.
Well, thank you, Susan, and welcome and good morning to everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm Chet Zablak, an Executive Vice President with Enterprise Bank. A nonprofit collaborative is a series of presentations that Enterprise Bank hosts each year for our nonprofit community. As a commercial bank, with community as one of our core values, our culture has always embraced our local nonprofit organizations whose missions make the communities where we do business better places to live and work. We offer these seminars for free, which is something we are able to do based on the banking and wealth management business that our customers have with Enterprise Bank. If you're currently a customer, many, many thanks for placing your trust in us. If you're not yet a customer, please give us some consideration. We'd love to be of assistance to you. It's now my pleasure to introduce Susan Lin. Many of us years ago had the opportunity to meet Susan when she led Project Learn here in Lowell. Today, she is the president and CEO of the Epilepsy Foundation of New England. She's a talented grant writer with 2 decades of nonprofit, higher education, and government leadership experience. Thank you, Susan, for being here. We look forward to your insights.
Great. Thanks, Chet. And thanks to the team at Enterprise Bank. Enterprise Bank has been a benefactor of nonprofit organizations in Greater Lowell and beyond. And it's been a privilege to get to know the community spirited side of Enterprise Bank. So I'm really glad to be here to present and to strengthen our nonprofit sector, which Enterprise is so invested in. So as Chet said, I'm Susan. I'm honored to be here today to talk with you. Hello to my friends at Project Learn, who I see have joined us today, and to all the other Lowell and Greater Lowell and Massachusetts nonprofits and Southern New Hampshire, I believe, who are here. I'm so glad to visit with you. Thanks for participating in the Zoom-based presentation today. I know that I've done lots of in-person presentations, and it's great to get to chat in person, which we're going to miss the opportunity to do today. But with that said, I encourage you to use the chat or the Q&A. My intern, AJ Salentano, and our friends at Enterprise Bank are monitoring the chat and the Q&A, and will interrupt me with your questions as we move forward. So again, I'm glad you're here. I want to just tell you that I have to take a mission moment and tell you that I am the CEO of Epilepsy Foundation New England. Epilepsy is a neurological condition characterized by electrical storms in the brain, and it affects 1 in 26 people in the United States, 72,000 people in Massachusetts, 17,000 in New Hampshire. If you or someone you know suffers from epilepsy, we'd love to be able to help. We have free resources that range from 15 summer camps to support groups to emergency financial aid, community education, and everything in between. Feel free to reach out to me personally if I can be of assistance to you or your loved ones. With that, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started on our presentation. Oh, I have to have my screen enabled, my screen sharing enabled by the host. Bear with us for 1 second, folks.
Sorry, Susan, let me work on that right now.
No problem. So, while we're getting started and we're waiting for screen sharing, again, I want to tell you that I've been a grant writer since I started my career as an MSW 20-something years ago. And for those of you who are newer to the grant profession or starting off, Most people who know me know that I'm really passionate about grant writing. It's such a unique opportunity to combine program planning, really assessing your organization with matching it to what you see in the community as needs, and crafting not only descriptions around what your organization is currently doing and persuasively technical writing to get that funding to really help your mission. It's also an opportunity as a grant writer to be a program planner and to help inform your organization about how best to position. We'll talk in a few minutes about how your grant really is only as good as your organization is. If you're writing a grant for an organization that doesn't have solid programs or is financially insecure or has other management issues, a grantor will see that, and you could write the best proposal ever, but if your organization isn't grant ready, it's really going to limit your opportunities. So when we say grant ready, we mean a strong organization with clear mission and programs and a sound management structure who's ready to seek grants. But as a grant writer, I think you might find yourself in a position, as I have many times, to apply your vision, your knowledge of the program and really analyzing the pieces in your attempts at grant writing to position your organization to be even stronger, to magnify the impact of the mission. That's what I love. And grant writing really truly is about 80% planning and 20% writing. So if you really like to plan, you really like to analyze problems, you really like to write persuasively, grant writing is a wonderful use of your talent. All right, let me see if I can screen share now. Oh, I still can't screen share. Okay, so let's see.
We are trying as hard as we can. I'm sorry for the delay on this.
No problem. Yeah, no problem. We're gonna make it work. We always make it work. Okay, so while we wait for that, our agenda for today. So we're going to spend some time talking about really basic fundamentals quickly. What is a grant? Second, we're going to spend the first half of the program talking about seeking opportunities. How can I find grantors that might be interested in my nonprofit organization? And then we'll spend roughly the second half talking about grant writing basics. We're not going to get into so much of writing each component of an application as much as we're going to get into tips and tricks to help your proposal stand apart and to give you your folks who are more on the beginner or moderate side of grant writing skills some ideas about how to really strengthen your proposals. And finally, we'll close with ideas about where to go for more information. All right, now I can share my screen. And so we will see if we can get started here. One moment while I start the slideshow. Okay, so we just read off the agenda. Okay, so I can talk to you all I want about how to write a grant. And you can take a class in grantsmanship. You can take several classes in grantsmanship, but there is no substitute for just diving right in. And the best way to learn grant writing is, in fact, sort of trial by fire, or getting started and getting your fingers wet, if you will, sitting at the keyboard and really understanding what a request for proposal is, what a grant application is. So I could, in the same way I could teach you, I can tell you with words how to do a dive. Until you do it, there's no substitute for really having that motion. So for those of you who are brand new to this or volunteers and you don't know where to get started, just get started, find an RFP and start putting pen to paper. That's the way to do it. So keep calm, breathe, and know that everyone's first experience in grant writing can feel a little overwhelming, but that's how everyone feels. So you're in good company when you get started with grant writing. Okay, so let's talk about for a second, what is a grant? A grant is a funding mechanism between a grantor and a nonprofit agency that typically funds a specific project. Some of you filled out questions in advance of today's workshops, and you noted that you were looking for grants for general operating expenses. Those are available, but increasingly rare to find a grant for general operating expenses. What's more common is to find grants that are interested in funding a specific aspect of the work that you do. Now, let's just unpack that for just a second, which is, when you say general operating expenses, so, I work for ABC agency, we'd love a grant of $100,000 to just fund what ABC agency does. Kind of hard to find those these days. But think about, what does ABC agency do? Let's say you're writing to the Amelia Peabody Foundation, who's specifically interested in disadvantaged girls. Maybe you have a program that is an after-school program, and it right now focuses on all children. Is there a way to craft a program within that, not to do something new and set your organization into mission drift, but is there a way to characterize what you're doing where a grant from Amelia Peabody would meet their goals of helping disadvantaged girls? So is there some way to carve out what you're doing from general operating into a more specific proposal? And I think in most cases, when you really, really start to analyze your programs, you might find success there. Grants are not free money. I know that I think that guy with the dollar bills hanging out of his suit at 1 o'clock in the morning is still out there in infomercials, but that's not true. There are a lot of charlatans out there that promise, you give us $500 and we'll give you access to millions of dollars in free money, or money for you're starting your business or your mortgage, and that's not accurate. Grants are funding mechanisms, again, between grantors and generally nonprofits, rarely individuals, and they carry a burden of compliance and reporting. So you have to know what you're getting into with a grant, and it's not free money. RFP, or request for proposal, sometimes people interchange the word grant with RFP. A grant is the funding mechanism. An application is what you write to a grantor to ask for money. And an RFP, a request for proposal, is the grant application itself. What a grant is not, I already said, it's not free money. It is restricted. Even the most liberal grantors still require grant reports and still require accountability, as they should, with the funding that you're giving. Grants are part of a development strategy, not the development strategy. If you're relying on only grants to fund your nonprofit agencies, strongly encourage you to take a look at diversifying your revenue streams. If you look at how funding flows in the United States to nonprofits, only a small fraction, less than 15%, is comprised of grants. The rest are comprised of individual donors. So I encourage you to have grants as part of your development strategy, but not even the most part of your development strategy. And is a grant science or art? It's both. There is a lot of science in technical writing and constructing proposals and program design, but it certainly is art as well. And as you get started with grant writing, you'll find your voice and your nonprofit's voice and ways to compel your grantors to want to invest in your nonprofit organization. And here's the actual definition of a grant. Move my screen around here a little bit. A gift bestowed to a nonprofit or governmental agency for specified purposes to an eligible recipient. And there you go again, specified purposes. So general operating grants are harder to find. Grants are usually conditional upon certain qualifications as to the use, maintenance of standards, or proportional contribution by the grantee or other grantors, meaning sometimes grants carry match requirements where your nonprofit or other partners have to demonstrate that they're also investing in the project that the grantor is investing in. So I guess read here, yes, there are strings attached to grants. In some cases, especially with federal grants, lots of strings attached to grants. Okay, so now we're going to move into finding grantors and who is out there that would be interested in helping your nonprofit organizations. The first place to look often is in your organization's purview. So who are the vendors of your nonprofit organization? What is the bank? Do they have a giving program? Do you have an IT vendor? What accounting organization do you use? Do you contract with marketing professionals? Who hosts your events? Do you have an event at ABC Hotel? So take a look and see who's around. And this, by the way, counts not just for looking for grant opportunities, it also counts for looking for sponsorship opportunities for your walk, race, gala, golf tournament. Don't forget to look in your own area to see who's around that might be interested in helping your nonprofit. And also take a look at your board members. So oftentimes board members have connections they don't even know they have. figure out if they, I had a board member who is a client of a bank on the North Shore. And he once brought me a piece of paper and he said, look, they have this charitable arm of this bank, and I'm a member there, and I have sort of a fair amount of business there, and I would help you to get to know the bank. And so we did, and it worked out in our favor. They might not have had Epilepsy Foundation New England at their forefront, but once they understood that my board member was really invested in why, with a personal connection to the mission, they were able to accept our grant application and provide us with some funding. So this is an important conversation to have with your board members. What are their vendors? What are their bankers? Would they be willing the next time they visit the bank to ask, is there a charitable giving program? And beyond that, again, some of your board members hopefully have strong business connections. We have a board member who is a research scientist, and most recently he's connected us with 5 or 6 organizations that are in the pharmaceutical space, who may not have epilepsy front and center of things they care about, but they certainly have him front and center, and he has a personal connection to our mission. So opening that door, using your board members to open doors to see what grants are available, is an important strategy, and maybe a first strategy in finding grant applications to submit. Beyond your local friends, there are the Foundation Directory online is probably the most robust, preeminent clearinghouse for grant information in the United States, and at this point in Europe as well. And the Foundation Directory Online was started by the Foundation Center, which is a national organization that serves grant makers as well as grant seekers. The Foundation Directory Online, if you buy it directly from the Foundation Center, or I think it's now called Candid, it's very expensive. I'm talking over $1,000 for an individual user subscription. I think the last time I looked, it was something like $1,250. But the good news here is that it's typically free at your local library. So you can call your local library, and then we'll talk in a minute about another library that you might be able to access. Here's an example of the Foundation Directory Online of how you can sign in and look. It's a really easy to use search tool, the easiest. So you can look by your organization's, your location or the grantor's location. You can really pick very specific search criteria. So I could look for foundations that are interested in serving the disability community in Greater Lowell, Massachusetts. And it would pull up a list for me of organizations that care about the disability community. I could look for epilepsy. You can really spend lots of time creating a pretty solid list of grantors. There's really almost no replacement for the Foundation Directory Online. If you haven't been familiar with it, strongly encourage you to get access. Here's another example. So I did a search for just grantors in Massachusetts. You see Massachusetts in purple highlighted on the top. And there's 3,644 grant makers who are interested in funding organizations in Massachusetts. And then they spit out this list for me. No surprise, the Boston Foundation is on top here. But there are, there's so many organizations to call through, and using the tools on Foundation Directory Online, you can really narrow your search and see exactly, are you interested in Jewish welfare organizations in Massachusetts? You can really specify your search criteria to a very great extent. And then what they spit out for you on the other end of the Foundation Directory is a really detailed list. I'll show you in a second. I made myself this note here because I had several questions in advance of today's presentation about finding grants for arts and culture. Using the Foundation Directory Online, you can get really specific about looking for organizations that fund arts and cultural organizations. Same thing with capital. You can do a search for organizations for grantors that are interested in capital campaigns or capital expenditures. Very easy to use tool. And this is an example of what you get on the other side. So let's say you narrowed it down to something that the Liberty Mutual Foundation was interested in. Take a look to the left here of the information available. So you can take a look at their it links right from the site to their application process, their website, the current request for proposals they have available, the nonprofits financials, their funding interests, past grantees, who's on their board, who's on their staff, and all of that information is really important as you think about approaching a grantor. If you take a look and see that there's some overlap between your board and their board, wow, that's absolutely fantastic. And you can take a look and see what do they say they fund versus what have they actually funded. So let's say you're a YMCA and you're really interested in health programs for middle school boys, and you look and you see that the Liberty Mutual Foundation funded the Boys and Girls Club. That's a good indication that they might be interested in your type of program. So this really is an awesome tool, expensive but awesome tool. And this might be a key for some of you to get there. So regardless of whether you decide you want to use the Foundation Directory online, Philanthropy Massachusetts is a wonderful Massachusetts serving organization. I know there's some folks here, I think from New Hampshire, and Philanthropy Massachusetts is still an organization to take a look at. New Hampshire has the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits, which is similar to Philanthropy Massachusetts in some ways, and an important research for our New Hampshire friends. So Philanthropy Massachusetts is a clearinghouse of organizations. It's basically the Foundation Center for Massachusetts, and is focused on serving grant makers, connecting grant makers to investing nonprofit organizations in our communities. And it's a wonderful place to find information and connection. And most recently, they have the Foundation Directory available. So once you participate in a membership with Philanthropy Massachusetts, and I'll show you those costs in a second, you can make an appointment and you can use the Foundation Directory for free as part of your membership. You do have to make an appointment because they can only have one user on at a time. But I went on yesterday to see if I could make appointments, and there were appointments available today, tomorrow, and Monday. So it doesn't seem like there's a huge waiting list for appointments. In addition, Philanthropy Massachusetts has a really talented staff that, especially if you're newer, librarians there will help you to get started and try to show you the ropes. Here's an example too of their request for proposal database. This is free. You don't have to be a member to look at the request for proposal database or just subscribe to their newsletter. And they just keep a running post of things that might be of interest to a larger swath of the nonprofit community. So take a look at that. And sometimes you're inspired. Sometimes I make a note in my calendar when I have time to just every Friday morning, take 5 minutes and look at what Philanthropy Massachusetts is talking about. And Philanthropy Massachusetts also has these resources available. So you'll see here upcoming events. They have workshops. Workshops often come with a fee for members or non-members. So you could access workshops at a slightly higher fee if you don't want to become a member. And then they have really interesting articles to stay informed about. It's a great resource to know about. For those of you who maybe have been around a little bit longer, this used to be called the Associated Grant Makers of Massachusetts. And they are a nonprofit organization. They do conduct themselves as a nonprofit organization. They're really there to serve. Their priority customer is grant makers, but then they help grant seekers and nonprofits as well. In addition, oftentimes grant makers who use Philanthropy Massachusetts to help them running their foundations use the AG or the Philanthropy Massachusetts Common Proposal Form. So what Philanthropy Massachusetts has done is encourage grant makers to have one standard set of applications, and many foundations in Massachusetts participate in that. So once you have a common proposal form, you already have a lot existing that you can transfer to other grant applications for other foundations that participate in this program, which I say, again, is a fair amount. And as I promised, here are the rates of participation. So, you know, based on your organizational budget, this is the annual dues of Philanthropy Massachusetts. I encourage you to have a look. I actually didn't this add-on here, so you can have an add-on to have customized grant research and a free attendance at Meet the Donors. So they have these Meet the Donors forums regularly. I feel like I see them every couple of months. Most recently, I saw Meet the Donors in Western Massachusetts, or Meet the Donors who are interested in early childhood education. So that might be something to analyze whether it's worth the investment for your nonprofit organization. Another important source of information for understanding what grant proposals are available, or grant applications are available, is to network with other grant writers. Grant writing can be a lonely activity because often nonprofits don't even have one grant writer. It's part of someone's existing job. We saw that at the beginning of the polls, that many of you are executive directors or volunteers or board members. And trying to find others who speak your language and know what you're talking about and can share ideas and grant opportunities is an important resource. When I first started grant writing in Massachusetts, I worked for the Newton Public Schools, and we started building a coalition of grant writers in K through 12 districts that started with me and one other woman who had lunch once a month. And by the time we were done 3 years later, we had about 22 people that would gather in Metro West to have lunch on a monthly basis and just share stories about what we were learning about grants and what we were learning about RFPs available. So it's good to find your people. There are different community-based collaboratives. I believe in Lowell, the Greater Lowell, I can't remember the name of the organization, maybe someone in the chat will tell me. It's a group focused on sharing development strategies that meets on a monthly basis. And if you look around, call other nonprofits, I think you'll find, if you haven't already, that the nonprofit sector in Massachusetts and Southern New Hampshire is very, very strong and caring and mostly interested in collaboration. So think about calling someone that has your position in a like organization and building connection. This screen shows the Grant Professionals Association. This is a membership organization for grant seekers, grant writers in the United States. I was heavily involved in this organization about 18, 19 years ago and found it extremely helpful. They have an annual conference, which is coming up the first week in November. This year it's available in person, I can't remember the location, and online for those who feel uncomfortable flying or can access it more easily in the online space. And it's filled with volunteer speakers who talk about all manner of topics in grant writing. So it's professional development, and it's also really important networking. The Grant Professionals Association has chapters across the United States. I checked it out earlier this week, and there is a New England chapter, and they do get together regularly to share community, but also to share strategy, to have workshops. So this is an organization to think about. It is membership. There is a fee. I believe I posted these. Yeah, I did. Okay. So here are the membership levels for those of you who might be interested in participating in the Grant Professionals Association. Great place to get information. And then locally, make sure that you're aware of what's going on in your community where your nonprofit is housed. So is there a community foundation? And if there's a community foundation, it might make sense for you to make an appointment to go talk to the community foundation staff and see what they know about giving at the community foundation, but also what they know about other grantors in the community. Community foundations are generally a wealth of information. Even if they don't have a perfect grant program for you to apply to, they may know who does. And often community foundations have programs for nonprofits that teach skills, that encourage collaboration. So it's great to get networked in there. I know Greater Lowell Community Foundation is a strong nonprofit serving Greater Lowell. Central Mass Community Foundation. The Boston Foundation is a community foundation, very, very strong, obviously, community foundation, and something to really pay attention to. Same thing with your city is, go ahead, Heidi.
Yeah, a question that was asked by Mike was saying, can two separate nonprofit organizations apply jointly for a grant? Absolutely,
yeah. I think there's a lot of grantors that are super interested in collaborative proposals, and absolutely encourage collaboration, especially if you're both impacting the same mission. There's usually strength in numbers, and yeah, you definitely can collaborate, encourage you to do that. Best conversation there is with the grantor. Are they interested in a collaborative proposal? Would they entertain that? And I've written so many collaborative proposals with up to 15 partners. It's wonderful to have that strength in the community and strength in collaboration building. AJ, are there any other questions that we want to ask right now?
There's no questions as of now.
Thank you. Okay, so the other local resource to pay attention to is what's going on with your city and community development. Not a bad idea to call the community development folks in your cities or towns offices and say, hey, you know, we're a nonprofit food pantry serving, you know, the Groton area, and we're wondering if there's any funding resources to help. And again, even if the city or community development agency doesn't have a grant stream for you, they're probably pretty informed about how funding flows and may be able to point you in the right direction for seeking additional grant resources. At the government level, don't overlook state and federal and other quasi-governmental granting agencies. I think sometimes people are intimidated when they're newer to grant writing about state and federal governmental grantors, and I'm here to tell you, don't be intimidated. Take a look and see. If you are an arts and culture organization, you should take a look at the Mass Cultural Council. If you are an organization that's interested in K through 12 education, take a look at the U.S. Department of Education. There are agencies like HRSA, the Human Resources and Services Administration, that invest heavily in the social service sector. It may not be that your organization is grant ready or that you have the grant skills today on the very first day to articulate a federal grant proposal, but there's no way to get started but to get started. So take a look and start reading what's going on. Pay attention, subscribe to the listserv or newsletter of the agency that most closely aligns with your mission. So I've been doing this at Epilepsy Foundation New England, and we started applying for AmeriCorps funding to have AmeriCorps members serve at hospitals across New England. And today we went from zero to we have $750,000 supporting 30 people who are providing epilepsy resource rooms in 11 hospitals in the 4 states we serve. And people told me that it wasn't possible. It's possible. It just takes a little study and a little positioning to get yourself there. Same with the state. There are tons of funding streams coming down from the state, and it's good to pay attention. Don't think that because you're a small nonprofit that you're automatically ineligible. And making connections with state-based agencies in your field is a really important opportunity for learning and connection to other organizations. So being known, having your mission out there, having the state understand that you exist and you're contributing to the welfare of Massachusetts or New Hampshire residents is important. Take the time to build those relationships. Grants.gov is the federal clearinghouse for information on grants. Take a look at it. At first, when you look at grants.gov, it can feel crazy making because there's so much information from so many federal agencies. Just like with everything, it takes a couple of minutes to orient yourself to what's going on with grants.gov. There is a very easy to use search feature on grants.gov. And then the grants.gov system of starting a grant application in a system called Workspace. It's not necessarily intuitive at first, but there are plenty of people that can help you get started. And after an hour or two of looking at grants.gov, I promise it'll become clearer and clearer how grants.gov works, just like with any new technology or system that you may be unfamiliar with. And grants.gov does have a subscription service where you can get daily or weekly notices about any grant posted that has to do with, in my case, epilepsy or disability, or it can be, hunger, welfare, animals, environment. So you can set your preferences and get a daily notice of anything that might come up that might be applicable to you. And I think finally, another important place to look for grantors is who is funding your competitors and collaborators. I use the word competitors with quotation marks because as someone who's really dedicated to the nonprofit community, I encourage collaboration above all else. We have to keep our eyes on the mission of what we're trying to accomplish, see who's in our community and work together, not against each other. But at the end of the day, we are sometimes competing against other organizations for funding. So that's why I use the word competitor in quotation marks. Who is funding them? So if you are I mentioned the Y and the Boys and Girls Club earlier, they have similar missions that intersect at some points. In my case, I am the Epilepsy Foundation. So I might look and see who's funding the Epilepsy Center at Mass General Hospital. You might be a arts, a lot of you said education. Let's say you are you're trying to build resources for K through 12 after school programs. What other after school programs exist? Where are their funding sources coming from? It's easy to find that once you look on their webpage at their financials. And often nonprofits appropriately thank their grantors by having their logos or a list of here's who supported us. If you can't find it there, you can usually look at a nonprofit's 990. We'll talk about that in a minute to see where their funding sources come from. So it is important to look and see who's interested in your particular area as you think about what grantors might be appropriate to approach. Okay, so let's stop there and see in thinking about researching grant opportunities, what questions do you have or what other suggestions do you have that you might want to contribute?
Susan,
Yeah.
there was a question in the chat actually about, not specifically about, but just in general, will this presentation be available after the webinar?
It's a good question. I'll have to turn over to the team at Enterprise.
We are recording this and we will have it posted to our website after this.
Great. Any other questions, AJ?
There is no open questions at this time.
Thank you. Okay, then let's move on. So we're going to talk about how to apply for a grant. I mentioned this before, but first and foremost, as a grant writer, you can only be as good as your organization. So if you're trying to write a grant for an organization that's really struggling, it's really going to be difficult for you to be successful getting a grant. And frankly, even if you do get a grant for an organization that's really struggling, it may be very difficult for the organization to manage and implement the grant. So here's a little checklist of things that might be considered a checklist of grant readiness for a nonprofit organization. You should have a mission statement. You should have a strategic plan. You should have a community needs assessment. You have an analysis of service providers. You should have a diversified operating budget, policies and procedures. You should have grant management capacity. We'll talk about that again in a minute. Partner discovery and engagement. So figuring out who is doing the same work you're doing in the space that you're doing it. And a project strategic plan. So a plan for the specific program for which you're applying for a grant. If you're an organization that's just started, you don't have your 501c3 yet, applying for a grant is probably premature. You might want to get yourself ready and understand these parts of grant readiness of an organization and what's going on with the grant funding landscape. But it's also true that if you don't have a 501c3, you're probably not going to be successful because most grantors almost exclusively won't fund an organization that doesn't have a 501c3. And then recently I was talking just yesterday with an organization that's really had a downturn because of COVID-19 and a staffing change, and they were already a small nonprofit and they are going into debt. And so that's looking not so good. And I think most grantors would have a hard time funding an organization that seems to be on the decline. So your organization needs to be grant ready. AJ?
Yes. There was an open question that just popped up a minute or two ago after.
Sure. Yeah.
And it says, is there anywhere you can review successful grant applications?
Yeah, there is. For one, There is, if you're looking for federal and state grant applications, there's the Freedom of Information Act, which requires governmental agencies to make grant proposals available to you. But before you use the Freedom of Information Act to request proposals, it's good to go to grantees and say, hey, I was wondering if you would share your proposal. This goes back to the Grant Professionals Association, Philanthropy Massachusetts, and in building a network. I openly share pretty much any grant application I'm asked for. I can't think of a time where I've said no. And I think most grant professionals and nonprofit professionals have that spirit of, here, learn from what I did. Feel free to flatter me by copying anything that I have in here. So that's a space to go. You can go to the grantor. So you want to apply to ABC Foundation. Do you have examples of successful proposals? It's another strategy for looking. And then if if I mention something today or others do, and you'd like a copy of a successful proposal, please feel free to ask. And I think most people here today would have that same bent. At least I hope so.
Do you have time for 2 more questions, or
Sure.
do you want?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's do it.
One question was asked in the chat, and it says, is it okay to ask a foundation to talk to you about why you did not receive a grant?
Absolutely.
I think it would help me going forward, but not sure if I'm committing I'm not sure how exactly that's pronounced by asking.
Yeah, great. Great question. And the answer is yes, you should definitely ask. You should ask whenever possible. If you're applying, what doesn't matter if it's a foundation or a governmental source, you should try to build a relationship in advance of the grant proposal. The things that you can find out from talking to a foundation staff or program officer is astounding. And I've done this regularly. I got turned down 1 year by the Tufts Health Plan Foundation for a grant that I really thought had all the criteria that it should have had to be successful, to do an initiative with older adults' mental health. And I called and we had an hour-long meeting where they talked about their priorities and what they liked and didn't like about our application. And at the end, it turned out that we just sort of probably missed it by a hair. And that gave us what we needed to apply the second year, and successfully did so. So we took that feedback. The following year came around. We met again with the program officer and said, hey, remember us? This is the feedback you gave us last year. This is what our proposal is shaping up. Do you have any advice? Wonderful opportunity. And I just want to say about that, there are foundations that don't have staff. And if it says things like absolutely no phone calls, don't call them. You might send an email. Not all foundations can do this, but for those who can and who are willing to provide you feedback, 100% take advantage of that. Go ahead, AJ.
The second question was asked by Paul and says, how is a diversified operating budget different from an operating budget? Oh,
great questions. Thank you for asking that. So a diversified budget is one that has 4 or more revenue streams. And when I say that, what I mean is thinking about Epilepsy Foundation New England's budget, we have roughly $600,000 that comes from our clothing donation recycling program. We have roughly $1 million coming from grants. We have roughly $500,000 coming from events like walks. We have about $300,000 coming from special events like galas and golf tournaments. We have money coming from a small amount of money coming from fee for service. And we have resources coming from individual gifts, which includes annual appeals and major gifts work. So that's what I mean by diversified. If all of your funding is coming from a grant from Housing and Urban Development, what that means is if Housing and Urban Development goes away, or there's a major shift in funding by Housing and Urban Development, your organization is going to be in massive trouble. Or if you are overly reliant on one major donor who, let's say your budget's $1 million and this person's giving you $800,000 a year. I know we wish we had that problem. But that's over reliance on one funding stream. So you really want to have a portfolio that if one funding stream were to completely implode, that your organization wouldn't have to shut its doors. That's the answer to that question. AJ, are there other questions?
Those are all the questions I can see at this time.
Thanks, AJ. Okay, we'll keep going. Keep asking your questions and we'll stop along the way to get them. And we'll do some question answer at the end as well. Okay, so I said I wasn't going to go into these, but just for the sake of clarity, this is what a grant proposal looks like. Generally speaking, there's usually a cover letter, one-page letter, or these days an email, an executive summary or some sort of an abstract or one paragraph that says succinctly what your proposal is, followed by a needs statement. Why should a grantor invest in you? What are the needs of the clients? Goals and objectives. Important to get the difference between goals and objectives correct. So if you're unclear about this, and every time I do this, I go back to what is a SMART goal again, and make sure I refresh my memory on what a goal and objective is. Then the methods section, the program design. This is usually the most heavily weighted section of a proposal. Evaluation of the proposal or the project you're trying to do. There's usually a question about other funding or sustainability. You can ask me about that at the end and I'll give you a good tip for how to answer the sustainability question. And then your general organizational information, organizational background, and then finally the project budget. So what I'll say about this for now, and then we'll defer the actual sections of a proposal to another workshop or to further study. You should start, in my view, with the budget. So what are you going to use the money for? What do you need? And the budget should tell the story of your proposal. And if you do this at the very end, I think you're getting it wrong, and that the budget is essential to informing how you will structure your grant proposal. I also have a huge bias to having a work plan. A work plan is an information organizer, a graphic organizer that shows who is going to do what and by when. So if you have just thinking about a table, and in the far left column, Susan Lynn is going to complete a workshop about getting started with grants by September 30th. That kind of infographic is a really helpful planning tool for everyone in your nonprofit organization and usually makes a really compelling argument to a grantor when placed in the middle of the project design section. But today we're really going to go beyond the technical aspects of these sections and talk about more general things to think about as you approach grant writing, especially as you might be newer to the grant writing field. First and foremost, you really need to consider your audience. So the way you write a proposal to the Cummings Foundation is different than how you write a proposal to the US Department of Education, is different than you write a proposal to the Central Massachusetts Community Foundation. I think I see some stuff happening in the chat. AJ, is there a question?
Yes, there's a question that asks, do you have any suggestions on grant management software / project management software?
You know, I'm going to keep that question to the end. I'm making myself a note because we can talk about that. The short answer is I don't have a grant management software program, and I don't think there is one that's worth buying. I think you need to create a system yourself for how to track projects because they're all so divergent from each other. And you need to have a solid accounting software system that allows you to track grant funding in a separate pool than you do your general funds. But other than that, let's talk about that at the end. Thanks for the question. I don't need to shirk it off. There is also, if you look at Grant Professionals Association, there is a whole grant management thread in there of people. That's all they talk and care about is how to manage the project once it's funded.
The second question was asked in the Q&A. Our organization has a board, staff, and volunteer base that is not diverse, though we are attempting to be more diverse. More and more applications are asking about whether the diversity on the board, et cetera, matches the diversity of the clients served. How do we address these issues until we actually can be appropriately diverse? We serve low-income clients.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's a pressure and priority that all nonprofits are facing and have been actually for years, perhaps come to a head in the past 2 to 3 years. And if you're struggling with that, I'm struggling with it at Epilepsy Foundation New England. I attended a workshop yesterday by the, I guess it was the Newton Chamber of Commerce, which was about diversifying your board. And there were probably 50 nonprofits there trying to understand how to do this better. So first of all, you're not alone. And I think foundations know that. I think they know that it's not an overnight change, and it's hard. It's really hard to live in Massachusetts where 92% of the population is white, and you want to avoid tokenism, and you want to ensure that you build relationships with people who have real power on your board and in your management staff and in your volunteer base and in your client base. So I think, obviously, be clear and honest with your answers. I think it's okay to describe what 1 to 5 strategies your organization is currently undertaking in a clear, succinct way. So talking about that it's, in my case, it's a priority at every board meeting. We talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Second, we are hiring a chief operating officer who will have diversity, equity, and inclusion as part of their tactical priorities. And third, we have recently translated our website into Spanish and Haitian Creole to meet the needs of the Boston community. So if you have something like that, where you can really think with your executive director or your board chair about, hey, what are the things we're doing actively to diversify our board? That helps a foundation to feel like you're moving in the direction of their priority of equity and inclusion. AJ, was there another question?
Those were all the questions I can see at this time.
Thank you, AJ. Okay, so back to going back to grant writing, considering your audience. This is really important because it's not a one-size-fits-all model of writing grant proposals. Okay, who will be making the decision about whether your proposal gets funded? Is it a panel of people? And does that panel of people include professionals who understand your use of jargon? Sometimes foundations, I love it when they do this, they include clients in the decision-making process. So if you're writing a grant, are teenagers on the panel? Are older adults on the panel? Are people who speak English as a second language on the panel? If you think about what makes the most sense for writing to that particular audience, it's also true that if you look at a foundation's criteria, you can get a sense of their style. What does their website look like? What does their grant application process look like? What does their annual report look like? So for example, Rosie O'Donnell used to have a foundation, and I distinctly remember this because most of you who are writers will appreciate that I hate Comic Sans as a font. Like, I passionately hate it. Like, I am one of those people that has memes about how Comic Sans shouldn't be a font. And Rosie O'Donnell's foundation, which I think doesn't exist anymore, which was for early childhood education, was all written in like bright colors and Comic Sans, and you could see like the lightheartedness of it jumping out, even for people like me who hate Comic Sans. You could see the lightheartedness of the foundation. And so if you're structuring a proposal to the Rosie O'Donnell Foundation, it might not make tons of sense to go on and on and on about the research literature and, you know, quoting facts and figures. It might make more sense to tell anecdotal stories about how your work is impacting the lives of children. And then similarly, if you're writing a proposal to the federal government, I'll give you an example in a minute, you might want to stay really, really far away from using Comic Sans and having a more lighthearted approach. So it's important to really think about, who am I writing to? Who's going to review this? And if you don't know, you can ask. You can ask the grantor and say, hey, I'm wondering how funding decisions get made. So let's take a look at some examples. So there were some questions about capital campaigns and capital funding, and the Kellogg Foundation is a national foundation who's particularly interested in capital projects. And then more locally, the Richard and Susan Smith Family Foundation is a well-known foundation, I think based in Newton, that cares very much about especially the greater Boston community, but they have a bias toward funding capital. So I included those here for those of you who are interested in that. So thinking about the Kellogg Foundation, if this was more interactive, I'd try to get you to think about this, but since we're in this Zoom space, I'll just give you some answers. So the Kellogg Foundation is a working foundation that has a probably relatively large staff of professionals who are experts in their field. They have the resources to really think about their nationwide strategic impact or even global strategic impact. And they have folks who are really keenly interested in the science and data and sustainability of what you're proposing. So if you're writing to the Kellogg Foundation, you probably should have a pretty scientifically based, clear business model that Kellogg can invest in. Richard and Susan Smith Family Foundation is more of a family foundation. It's possible that folks that are on the Family Foundation's decision-making board are family members that might come from all different walks of life, that might come from all different professional perspectives. So you might have someone who's never set foot in a nonprofit organization before, and here they find themselves on the Smith Family Foundation's board. I have a friend whose family has a foundation, a relatively large foundation, and the way that it works for them is that they rotate on every 5 years. They have to do a 2-year term. And my friend, her industry is, she owns a restaurant. And so she's evaluating proposals about social service agencies. And, what does she know? She always says it's so informative to really look into the nonprofit sector and hear all these wonderful stories about how people are helping, but she's evaluating it from heartstrings, right? So she isn't in the science of how nonprofits works. She's in the feeling of how nonprofits work. And that might really inform how you structure your proposal. The Cummings Foundation, you should all know about the Cummings Foundation if you do business in Middlesex County. I think to some extent Suffolk County. Check them out because they have a really robust grant program. And the Cummings Foundation grant-making team is employees of the Cummings Foundation. Cummings is a real estate development agency. And so the people that are making decisions are administrative professionals, they're realtors, they're business people, and that too is more of a heartstrings decision-making. They might not understand the science of social work or the science of food insecurity, but they definitely understand hunger, and they definitely understand what it means to help a struggling family. So you might think about how your more scientific writing combines with a story around why the work you're doing is so important. The Massachusetts Service Alliance in blue here, that has an AmeriCorps proposal that's out right now, or an RFP that's out right now. They accept reviewers from across Massachusetts. In fact, you might sign up to be a reviewer. Even if you don't particularly care about the AmeriCorps program or the Mass Service Alliance, being a grant reviewer is the best professional development that money can't buy. So you're volunteering your time, you'll be assigned a handful of proposals to read, you'll get to participate in a community panel about making funding decisions. And it's so informative to see what people are thinking about as they're making funding decisions. Plus, it's a great community service. Mass Service Alliance is a wonderful organization. So you might want to check them out and see if you can raise your hand to be a community grant reviewer. I just saw a notice about this a couple of weeks ago, so I think the time is right to see if you can still throw your name in the ring to be a community grant reviewer. And so if you think about that, who's raising their hands to do this for the Mass Service Alliance? Probably really well-intended community members and or nonprofit professionals. Gear your proposal appropriately. Department of Education, they probably are looking for more scientific proposals. Their grants are read by Department of Education employees primarily, usually, and or sometimes they recruit district personnel to help evaluate proposals. So these are folks that really know about education, and it's okay to use maybe jargon around scaffolded learning or gosh, I don't know, different types of social emotional learning. And social emotional learning means something to those that are doing it day in and day out, but might not mean something to people who aren't in it, day by day. And finally, I gave you an example of UCB. It's a pharmaceutical company that Epilepsy Foundation New England partners with to a very great extent. And their proposals are read by business office professionals. And what they're looking for is, how does this proposal let UCB get our name out there in association with Epilepsy Foundation New England? So a lot of what they're looking for is, how is there a marketing advantage to UCB in this proposal that we find ourselves evaluating.
There was a question actually in the Q&A that was saying if the grant writer is a 1099, is it appropriate to work their fee into the grant proposal?
No, it really isn't. Almost never is it appropriate to work your fee into the grant proposal. Occasionally you'll find a grantor that says the costs of the application preparation process can be considered in the grant budget, but it's quite rare. I don't recommend it. I think that when you do that, you're also working on contingency. The message there is that if you get the grant, I get paid. And your services are worth something beyond whether or not the grant proposal gets funded. As I mentioned, you can only be as good as your organization, and you are providing a service. Even if that particular grant proposal doesn't get funded, hopefully you've left your mark on the nonprofit agency so that they can grow from what you've already done for them. They can recycle, your proposal and benefit from it. You would never ask a tax accountant to work on contingency of, depending on how much money you get back for me is how much money I'll pay you. That's not how it works. It's also against the code of ethics of the Grant Professionals Association, so wouldn't recommend that.
Those are all the questions that I can see at this time.
Thanks, AJ. Okay, so in addition to thinking about who is your audience, who's making the decision as you're crafting your proposal, match missions. So a lot of times I hear, especially newer grant writers saying, I found this perfect foundation. They really care about, pick on my own organization again, they really care about neurological disorders in Greater Boston, and they're particularly interested in transition aged youth going from childhood to adulthood. And I really want to write this proposal, it's perfect. And you look and it says, we only fund Parkinson's disease. Well, everything else is perfect except for this one problem. Newer grant writers tend to have this frame of reference of, yeah, but like it's close enough. Like if they only hear our story, they're going to be sure to fund us. And I'm here to tell you that that's not the case. So make sure you invest your energy and resources and your writing time and your planning into proposals that have the best chance of coming out successfully. And the best way to do that is to look for a matching mission. And the second best way to do that is to call the foundation and ask them if your project seems like a good fit with what they're looking for. And the third way is to look at the past organizations they funded, and we'll talk about how to do that in a second. But if you feel like there's any kind of mismatch here, really encourage you to take stock of, is it really worth your time to apply for a grant that has a kind of a long shot or has this one like, oh, they only fund in Greater Boston, but we're just across the border in Salem, New Hampshire. We're so close. No, that's not how it works. So conserve your resources.
I'm sorry.
That's okay, go ahead.
There's a question that was asking, what is fair compensation as a grant writing consultant for a small nonprofit?
Oh gosh, it's all over the map, and there is no one price that I could say is fair. It depends on the size of the project. It depends on the size of the nonprofit, depends on your skill level. I think that there's two ways to structure consultancies. One is on an hourly basis and one is on a project basis. I strongly prefer the latter of a project basis. So you evaluate the proposal and the nonprofit and how much work is, and you say, hey, I think it's going to take me 20 hours to do this work, and my fair market value for hourly rate is $50, and therefore I'm going to charge X for the project. I think that's better than trying to track your hours per proposal, but I've seen rates from $20 to $25 an hour to $175 an hour for proposal writers. And so it really is dependent on a lot of other variables. It's also true that there's provisions, regulations around sharing hourly rates. So you'll be hard pressed to find information on the median or mean hourly or project-based fee for grant writers, because you're not supposed to share information that sort of contributes to sort of an underhanded market of fixed price fixing for consultant fees. It's hard to find that information, and kind of have to go with evaluating your own skills and what you think you're worth to the nonprofit organization.
Those are all the questions I can see at this time.
Thanks, AJ. Okay, so remember the golden rule of fundraising. If you've heard me talk about this, anything in fundraising and grant writing before, you've heard me say this. The golden rule is in fundraising is he who has the gold makes the rules. And that's really important because as a grant professional or a nonprofit fundraiser, you can get frustrated with, hey, this is why are they going to fund only Middlesex County, or why are they, stopping short of, they're funding 6 to 18-year-olds, but 18 to 20-year-olds are so important. Like, what is wrong with them? Or why are they creating this application process that asks the same question in 3 different ways and makes me double back on myself, or has this ridiculous character count, or just pay attention to that, because I think it comes through in your writing. I've seen proposals written where, the grantor asks for the same question in a few different ways, and a frustrated grant writer will say, see question 1. And that's not the way to go, right? So you're asking for a gift, and you may not like the rules, but they are the rules and you're choosing to apply. So encourage grace and humility, and thinking about making sure that you're approaching the work from knowing that you're asking for a gift. And it's important to follow the rules and follow their rules, even when they're sometimes frustrating. Oops, sorry about that. Go back. Okay, so the best indicator of future behavior is past behavior in all things. Someone asked earlier about getting copies of past proposals. That's here. And I mentioned the Freedom of Information Act. I also mentioned collaboration, asking other people in our community, hey, can I get a copy of that grant you wrote? I think you'll usually find is met with a favorable attitude. But the other places to find this information, best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, is the grantor's 990. And you can find that in 2 ways. You can, or actually probably more than 2 ways, but these are the 2 ways that I find it. So one, we already talked about the Foundation Center or Philanthropy Massachusetts. In that database I showed you, you might have noticed that you can click on 990s or financials. Oh, and I should say for folks who are newer, a 990 is the tax return of a private foundation or a nonprofit organization, and they're public knowledge. They must be posted publicly. If you didn't know this about yourself and you work for a nonprofit, you can find your own nonprofit's 990 and read it. And it tells an important story about what's going on in the nonprofit organization. So when you look at a foundation's 990, it tells you who they have funded in the past. Why this is so important is you can read the funding guidelines of ABC Foundation, and you could say, hey, it seems perfect. They really like funding early literacy organizations in central Massachusetts. And they're really interested in early literacy that includes literacy for ages 1 through 5. And my organization serves the very youngest children, 1 through 3. We have this wonderful program. And then you go and look at their 990 and you see that 95% of their grants have been made to K through 12 organizations. Well, that's not your organization. So what's really going on there? Or you'll see a foundation that says, we serve all of Massachusetts, but we have a preference for Greater Boston. But then you look at their 990 and 100% of the people they have funded are in Boston. So then if you're in, Worcester, what does that tell you? It tells you it's probably a long shot. Their preference for Boston is almost a rule. And so it might not be worth articulating a proposal to them.
There was actually a question in the chat, and it said, where do you find these 990s?
Yeah, so perfect. So you can look at what I mentioned, the Foundation Center or Philanthropy Massachusetts, using the Foundation Directory online, calls them up. But then there's also GuideStar. There's other organizations too, but GuideStar is free. So you can register for a free account to use GuideStar, and take a look at guidestar.org, set yourself up for a free account, and you can search for any nonprofit organization in the United States, possibly beyond, and quickly brings you to a spot where you can download their 990. So that's another way to do it. You can also usually look on the foundation's website. They usually post their own 990s if they have a website. And I'm going to show you an example now.
Is it okay if there was another question in the Q&A. Is it okay if I ask now or?
Go ahead, AJ. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Somebody asked, I have had a for-profit since 2016, and I just registered it into a nonprofit charitable fund this year. What is the possibility of receiving a grant today, as we are a I'm trying to pronounce the word, rehabilitation program. I'm trying to, rehabilitation.
Is it in the Q&A?
Yes, I'm having a hard time pronouncing it because it's an
Oh,
unfamiliar word.
rehabilitation. Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry, my bad.
Yeah. Thanks for the question. It's not very great because the grantor world will want to understand, what your nonprofit status is. There's provisions about how foundations make gifts that require them to give only to 501c3 nonprofit organizations, or sometimes 501c other 4, 5, or 6 organizations, but it's very rare to be able to make a grant to an organization that does not have their 501c3 status. When that happens, it's usually because you receive a provisional letter from the IRS saying, we've received your application, we're processing it. You should expect your nonprofit notification in the next 60 days or 90 days. And occasionally, if you have an investor, whether it's an individual or a grantor that really believes in your cause, maybe somebody that is already close to the organization, and they might make that risk calculation and say, hey, I really believe this organization is going to get their 501c3, so I'll make the grant in 2021 and wait for their nonprofit status to come through so that I can claim it as a charitable contribution to a nonprofit organization.
And one last one. Also, when I'm asking these questions, just let me know if you'd rather wait for a separate time or do it right now. So we have been in business for a very long time, and with my own money. So my inheritance money ran out. Now I have to register. It says now registration has to be filed for 501c3. I'm not quite sure what that, but if you look in the Q&A, you'll see what I mean.
Yeah, that's true, that you do need to, if yes, essentially, yes, you need to incorporate as a 501c3 if you want to proceed as an independent nonprofit organization. That's a really specific question. So I think AJ, we're going to stop with questions for a little bit, just because I see that it's already 10:15, and I want to be sure we end on time. So let me get through this next few minutes, and then we'll come back to some questions if we can at the end. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So this is an example of a 990 from the Amelia Peabody Foundation. And this is just the front page. The first time you read a 990, it can be a little overwhelming, but trust me when I say just go to page 11, because that is where you will find this. It even says in here, page 11. Occasionally it's an attachment to the end of the 990, but this is where the list of previous grantees is given. It tells you who they gave to, and it tells you the amount of money they gave. And the amount of money they gave is also super important, because sometimes you'll see a request for proposal and it doesn't specify the ceiling or the floor for what the grant award range is. It just gives you this nebulous nothing. So how do you decide what's an appropriate ask? Is it 5,000? Is it 50,000? This might help you. And so you take a look and see, hey, my organization is closely linked to this African Community Education Program in Worcester, and look, they gave them $40,000 on March 14th, 2019. That gives me a sense of what kind of investments they're making in organizations like mine. So this is a really important step. I never apply to a foundation that I don't read their 990 first. Strongly encourage you to take this extra step and look at what they've done in the past. Okay, some tips that might seem obvious, but they are common errors that new grant writers in particular make. Respond to the questions. After you write your response, read the question again. Did you really answer the question? It's a common complaint of foundations and grant reviewers that the respondents don't answer the question that was actually asked. So check in with yourself, maybe show somebody else what you're doing and see if they agree. Repeat yourself, I already mentioned. Don't say, see page 5, part 2. That's not a good choice. Repeat yourself if you have to, but not verbatim. Try to use new words, and he who has the gold makes the rule. When in doubt, call the foundation for clarity. Great opportunity for relationship building, and you can learn so much in those brief interactions with foundation staff, if they have them, that really inform your project planning and your chances for grant success. Remember that you have to write your proposal in terms of client needs, in terms of your mission needs, not your organizational needs. So if your proposal starts with, ABC, Epilepsy Foundation New England needs $100,000 to fund this new position, that's not quite right. What we need is $100,000 to do what the position is structured to do. To help more people, to provide social work services, because we see that's important need in our community. Make sure you're writing from the client's perspective. How will this funding impact the client? Foundations don't care about your organization and your organization's need. I just saw a pitch from that same organization I mentioned that I spoke with yesterday, who's really on the sharp decline. And they issued an urgent plea to their community saying, they basically said, we can't keep the lights on, so you need to give us money. No. We need money because we're having trouble. Well, I actually think that sending desperate pleas to the community is not a good choice, because people like to give to success, not to organizations that are in big trouble. But beyond that, you need to structure your ask for, how does your gift make a difference to people living with epilepsy, or people, animals struggling with homelessness post-pandemic. You don't need to write it in terms of the Humane Society desperately needs money because we can't employ our staff. Why do you need the staff? How is that important for caring for animal welfare? Avoid jargon unless you're sure that the review panel is composed of people in your profession. Use common words. So definitely think about making sure that you don't get so insulated into the work that you're doing that you assume that the reader knows what you're talking about. Remember my example of my friend who serves on her family's foundation, who's a chef and doesn't know anything about early, even literacy. What is early childhood literacy? You really have to spell out what those words mean and why they're important. And limit fluff. I avoid preaching, avoid value judgments in your language, avoid hyperbole, extremely awesome, fantastic, terrific. Those words probably don't usually belong in a grant proposal. Neither does, can you believe poor little Joey has been left to fend for himself? Just, a little bit more scientific, less preachy, if you will. Here's an example. I won't read this whole thing to you, but this is an excerpt from a proposal I wrote in the spring, and it is full of jargon. Like, most people who read this don't even know what it says. And the reason is that this is a proposal to the CDC, and the people who were reviewing it were CDC employees who were scientists, doctors, PhD and MD researchers. And they knew exactly what I was talking about, and they knew exactly what component B means, what QOL means, what PWE, which is person living with epilepsy, means. And EERR, they know what all that means. I would never write this proposal to anyone that wasn't working at the CDC on this particular project. So this is an example of a very jargon-based language, and gives you hopefully a contrast for what I hope that you're, sorry. right on cue. My garbage man is here, collecting my garbage, and my dogs don't like it. Just give me 1 second. Okay. Sorry, guys. We're all doing this Zoom from home, and I apologize. Okay, so other tips. Sometimes there's a tendency to want to use bold and italics in every line of a proposal. Don't do that. I would use those things sparingly. New grant writers tend to want to use full margin alignment to make it look like a magazine or a newspaper, where you have the left and right margin completely full. That's not good for readers. So readers of grant proposals who are often reading many, many proposals strongly prefer left margin alignment, even if it messes with your sense of graphic design. And think about white space and brevity. So think about people reading 20, 30 proposals. They like clear and concise language, and they like a little extra white space. So don't necessarily fill every page to the brim, but rather think about how to put forward a proposal that people with tired eyes want to keep reading. I strongly suggest using a storytelling approach. If you can write to a family foundation and you can make them laugh and make them cry, just like many good stories do, then that is, you really have, I think, a really solid proposal where you can get the reviewer to be really invested in the cause that you're trying to find support for. You can incorporate a case study, especially if you're doing something sort of hard to understand or something that you know a family foundation, it will help them to see the program in action. In that same grant I wrote to the CDC, I was asking for a database system that's kind of difficult to describe. And so I gave a case example of how a client might be better supported through a multi-layered assessment of their needs and goal setting, with not only a story about a make-believe client, but also a picture of what the dashboard of the software program looks like to really help the reader understand it. And this is not just for grants. So if you are an executive director or a volunteer, chances are you're doing a lot more fundraising than grant writing. And telling stories, having an arsenal of anecdotes about that time at camp when, I still tell the story about we had a camp at Ironstone Farm in Andover, and I was being a sidewalker. I was helping a little girl to make sure she didn't fall off the horse because she had epilepsy. And I asked her, how do you like camp this year? We were on a little trail walk, and she didn't say anything for a minute. And then she looked down at me and she said, "This is the only time I have friends," in this really quiet voice. "I really feel good here." And I swear I will remember this moment of looking in her eyes and her just like taking time to really reflect on what camp meant to her. And it isn't horseback riding, it isn't horsemanship. It isn't the occupational therapeutic benefits, which are there. It's the connection to other people. And I tell that story all the time. So storytelling is something you should incorporate into your grant writing and into your fundraising. Okay, here's an example I gave. I won't go into it now because we're running short on time in that proposal I mentioned. Use a proofreader. A lot of times we get so connected to our grant writing that it's hard for us to see the forest through the trees or common mistakes. I can't tell you how many people work in public education who wish they had done that, because the number of times you write the Cambridge Public Schools and you leave out the L from public is shocking, and spell check doesn't pick that up. And you can think for yourself about how that goes and how embarrassing it is when you make errors like that. It's also true that sometimes you get so into the grant and you've been working on it for so long that you kind of forget what you did before and what draft you're on, and you might omit a significant piece. Have your family member, a coworker. I used to have my office manager who didn't have, who wasn't really in the social service part of what we do. I used to have her read for me because she had a very objective perspective. And she could see some of the grammar things that I couldn't see being so close to the work. Okay, for further training, you should go to community colleges who often have grant writing training programs. Universities nowadays have certificates in nonprofit fundraising or grant writing. Philanthropy Massachusetts has a program that you can sign up for. It has lots of different workshops. And then the Grant Professionals Association I mentioned has that conference. I think they have other one workshop-y type programs that you can sign on to that I think are reasonable in terms of cost. But then there's also this. This is free. This is on Candid. So this is the Foundation Center's clearinghouse. You can listen to this free audiobook called The Foundation Center's Guide to Proposal Writing. So if you want to do a primer on the component pieces of a proposal, this might be a really good place to start. There are books, Grant Writing for Dummies by Bev, gosh, I can't remember her last name. I think Downing is her last name. But there are books, there's other grant writing books available. I think that if you pay attention to your community of grant writers, you maybe take this class and you get going, right? So as I mentioned at the beginning, you have to kind of dive right in. Look at your first RFP, put pen to paper or finger to keystroke and just get started. You'll find that you might have more questions, but there's no substitute for trial by fire. The grantsmanship training program, I should mention too, this is a really excellent grant training program for any level. They have beginner, intermediate, and advanced. They've been around for quite a long time, and most people feel like this is a good use of resources to do this, but it is quite expensive and cost prohibitive for some nonprofits or early career professionals. I can't remember how much it costs these days, but I want to say it's a couple $1,000s to participate in this intensive 5-day program, at the end of which you will have definitely a really good sense of grantsmanship. So it's out there. It's not cheap to do it. You have to make a calculation about whether it's worth it to you and your nonprofit organization. Okay. Oh, we're just at, looks like 10:28. And I want to turn it back over to Chet. I think I answered most of these questions as we went along. And maybe what I'll do is I'll turn it over to Chet and Rob and see if you have any closing remarks. And then I'll stay, if it's okay with Enterprise, for 5 minutes and try to answer some questions.
It is always okay, Susan, to stay with
Okay.
Enterprise. Thank you very much. Again, another very successful seminar. Susan, thank you for your time and effort, as well as the Epilepsy Foundation of New England for allowing you to do this with us. And AJ, thanks for your input as well. Susan, whenever you do a presentation for us on grant writing, and we all understand how important grant writing is, the people turn out in droves because this is such a critical area. And right now is also a very important time for everyone to find those funding sources. And a quick another thank you to Andrew Duncan for your leadership in making these so successful. And this is our 13th season. Andrew, you're doing a great job. We have 2 other seminars coming up this fall. First is October 26th. It is from stress to strength. Reverend Dean Shapley is going to be running that. And 2 days later, we have the LGBTQ seminar, History Unerased, with Deb Fowler. We hope you all can participate in those coming up as well. And as Chet mentioned earlier, if you are a customer, thank you very much. If you are not, we'd welcome the opportunity to take you on as a customer, whether it's commercial lending, cash management, mortgages, wealth management, or even just banking. We'd love to have the opportunity to do that. So we hope to see you again this fall. And those are my only comments, Susan. So if there are any other questions or anything you want to tie up, I'd love you to have the opportunity as well.
Great. Thanks, Rob. And again, great to be here. I do want to get to these questions and answer any Q&A. So we'll plan to stay about 9 more minutes until 10:40 to make sure that you get what you need from this workshop. We covered this section. These are the questions that were originally asked in the registration process. We covered applying for general operating expenses, which is generally that's difficult to find grantors that will do that, but there may be ways to reframe your general operating into project-based proposals. We talked a little bit about capital campaign grants. The key to capital campaigns is not sort of off the cuff grants, grantors. It's building relationships with foundations over time. And there are a few grantors that particularly care about capital. But in general, you need to be part of a larger capital campaign strategy, the bulk of which will come from major donors. When including a sorry, and then I'm going to go back here. When including a percentage of overhead in a program grant request, how should it be listed? As an indirect cost. So you can have the total direct costs of the project, and then whatever your indirect cost rate is, multiply that by that subtotal and add it to the total for the grand total. So if you are asking for a grant of $100,000 and your indirect cost rate is 10%, then your total is $110,000. Do all foundations want to know all the grants our organization is currently receiving? Nope. That's a really specific request by a particular foundation. Some do, some don't. I would say overwhelmingly they don't. When they are asking, consider why they're asking. Sometimes it's because who's funding you indicates the strength of your nonprofit. Hey, are our friends funding you? Because if our friends are funding you, I can A, call them and ask them how that's going. And B, that gives me an indication of the strength of your nonprofit organization. And they also want to understand your viability as a nonprofit. If you only have one other funding source, then maybe your organization isn't as strong as they'd like it to be for them to make an investment. Alternatively, you have foundations who are particularly interested in small nonprofits. And if they see that your list of grantors is pages long, they might say, hey, our $2,500 isn't going to mean so much in the grander scheme of this organization's $250,000 of grants, and they may back away. How do you manage grant conditions after grant award? Do you have a designated grant administrator? So at Epilepsy Foundation New England, where we have about $1 million worth of grants these days from various sources, the grant administration is done by myself typically because I'm really invested in grants, and also by our accounting firm. We don't have a separate grant administrator, and we don't, as I mentioned, have a grant management software program. I haven't heard of a successful grant management software program before, so I would be curious about other people's answers to that question. For me, it goes back to old-fashioned paper and pencil, paying attention, or these days Excel spreadsheets. But every grantor's conditions are so different that it's important to have a customized opportunity. There's been times where I've been a grant administrator, so I administered $11 million for the Newton Public Schools a year. And still then I used our accounting software program, and I had elaborate Excel documents to ensure that we were tracking our performance measures and that we were tracking our fund accounting. Did we find as much opportunity for sponsors or donors during the pandemic as in 2019 and before? I think the answer to that question is yes. There are some funding organizations that may have redirected their funding to help with COVID-19 recovery, and things like food insecurity or other economic difficulties that folks have encountered during the pandemic. But generally speaking, if you look at the impact of the pandemic on the economic landscape, it disproportionately affected lower income people, not so much higher income people and foundations. If you look at the value of foundations' assets and the values of their investments, they generally saw upticks during the pandemic, not downturns, as some segments of the economy, like hospitality and travel and tourism, saw. So I don't expect you're going to find dramatic downturns there in terms of what's available. Okay, AJ, what's in the chat that we should try to get to?
There's nothing specifically in the chat. It's just mostly like thank yous and everything, and everything, all the other questions were in the Q&A.
Okay.
That's all I can really see at the moment. And I'm pretty sure you went over a decent amount of them, unless there's one that you happen to miss, but
a quick look here myself and see.
Because as you were talking about it, I was like, okay, so you're kind of like going through.
Okay, I think we got to most of those. Grants that support faith-based nonprofits. That is a tricky one. So if a faith-based nonprofit has a 501c3 status, then it's a little bit clearer to be able to fund them. But if they don't have a 501c3 status, it's challenging, and would encourage you to use the Foundation Center or Philanthropy Massachusetts to see what organizations fund faith-based groups. The exception to this is probably Jewish cultural organizations. So it's not faith-based work, it's in the Jewish cultural tradition rather than the Jewish faith tradition. And so that might be broader applicability, but it's hard to find traditional grants for churches and places of worship. And then if an application says they fund within a range of 5 to 10, is it better to aim low, high, or mid-range with your request? You should ask for what you need and have a project budget that substantiates that need. Funders usually see through when you are adding fluff or asking for something that you're really trying to get at the money and not at the project. So just encourage you to be transparent and honest in your project budget and ask for what you need. And do you think client testimonials and proposals work? Sometimes they do. It depends on who you're asking the proposal for. So if you're asking for a small family foundation, probably a testimonial can be powerful. I wouldn't necessarily use pages. An alternative is to start with a quote. So at the top of the project narrative or executive summary, you might have a one-line quote saying, ABC agency helped me get to where I am today or changed my life. That can really be powerful. Again, especially if you're asking for a foundation, a grant from an organization where the decision makers are more lay people and people who are not scientists or professionals in the community. All right, I think I've gotten to all the questions in the chat. And will this presentation be available? Yes.
It will. We'll post it online. We'll scrub through it, make sure it looks fine and sounds fine, and we'll put it to our website in a couple of days. And also, you'll be receiving a survey as well, and maybe we'll attach this to the survey as well, the presentation. But if you can just take a couple of minutes for the survey, your input is very important to make this relevant for our future seminars.
Great. With that, Rob, Chet, friends at Enterprise, it's great to be here with you. And thanks to all of you who participated, and thanks to those who hanged on to the end here. It's great to see you. Good luck with your grant writing. And have a
Take
great
care.
day.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you,
All right.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, AJ.